Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast. This week, we're talking about the age of information. Now, before I get into it, I have to confess that I'm just getting over a cold, so I may have to mute the mic for some coughing spurts, but I will do my best to keep it up and to make sure that I'm speaking clearly enough. So apologies, but yeah. I've had a bit of a long week and my sister's here on a visit, so I'm glad that I got in time to set up and be ready to do this podcast. So let's get started. Before we jump into this week's topic, I'm going to talk a little bit about the continuation from last week. And so last week, for those who were listening, we talked about different methods of basically controlling humanity throughout history. Whether it's benevolent or malignant, it is a method for attempting to control large populations, and usually done through this sort of survival mechanism where a small group of people control whatever the resources or the different needs that people have, controlling the supply of that and basically managing the people in that way. And so we talked about Machiavelli, and we talked a little bit about how these systems developed over time. And to this day, we see a lot of the same systems still in place. And so I think this leads directly into the ecoVillage model. The ecoVillage model, among other things, one of its purposes is really to disrupt and change this current system. And so whether it's disrupting the cost of living industry, which is dealing with the practical methods of growing food so you don't have to buy it, collecting rainwater, etc. There's another plane, another plateau that the ecoVillage model is centered around, and that's a more political and sociological level. And this is really where it ties in to what we were talking about last week and what this week's episode is going to be about. So, the age of information. Now, I've been talking about the age of information and reading about it for quite some time, but as I was preparing for this episode, I went over a few entries to sort of get a grasp of the way that it played out throughout history. And so the age of information basically came after the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution, I'm sure everyone has heard of, and you all know the ramifications, but it is worth just going over a few key points which I think relate specifically to the ecoVillage model. And that is, there was obviously a huge transition from handmade items and hand-powered tools to a very mechanized system. Now, this was, of course, available and possible because of technological innovations and because of new resources becoming available. But I think there's a very big transition that we had there that nobody really noticed at the time, because obviously it was all viewed as being a huge step forward and progress and advancement. But we did lose something, and in a way, we lost a certain connection that the masters and the artists had with the material they were working with, the items they were producing. And there's this concept, which I don't know if you've heard of, which is called planned obsolescence. And it seems to be that over the last century or so, items that are being built are actually being built with worse quality than they used to be. Lots of people, especially I think of older generations, sort of remember that in their time things were built to last, etc. And it's true that nowadays the wear and tear of things is increasing dramatically. And so, hi, Meme, thank you. I don't think I've ever seen you here before, so welcome to the show, and thank you to all of you who are listening. I actually forgot to start with that. It is much appreciated. So, with the Industrial Revolution, we actually went through this form of separation from the natural world, separation from the items that we're dealing with, etc. And I think that it wasn't really noticeable, the drawbacks, until let's say, decades later when we see what the situation is now. And so this transition from the Industrial Revolution to the Age of Information was sort of signified. It was a long process and you could point to different parts of it. But, oh, excellent. Patient Zero has uploaded The Light Bulb Conspiracy. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. It's very, very interesting. And this is actually a much further stage from the Industrial Revolution, what we have today, which is getting to a point where there's so much to offer and that so much that's available that you actually have to plan to degrade things in order to continue to make a profit. But I digress. We're talking about the age of information, and one of the critical moments, the pivoting moments in this coming of a new age can be categorized by information technology. And so I'd like to just post a quote very quickly, which just gives a little point for us to remember. And let's have a look and see. 1958. So the term information technology in its modern sense first appeared in a 1958 article. It was published by Levitt and Whistler, and they commented that the new technology does not yet have a single established name. We shall call it information technology. And so this is the first time in history that that term information technology comes about. So what does this actually mean, information technology? Well, the term refers to a new kind of technology that has to do with storing and manipulating and retrieving data. And if we saw in the Industrial Revolution a transition towards a more mechanized, technological, and more distant from nature industry, then the information technology or the information technology revolution really took it a step forward from there. And so we see a further distancing of ourselves from what you could term physical reality through this use of a virtual reality, a reality that we can control completely, and that basically we can use that sphere, that reality, to store information and retrieve it. And we all see today, and we know exactly what amazing technological feats this has allowed us. Patient Zero has commented, the guy who invented pantyhose used to demonstrate his product by pulling automobiles with them. They didn't run. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. Wow, pantyhose. That's very interesting. I need if you have a name for that guy, I'd like to have a look at it afterwards. So when we talk about information technology, it's really a few key things that made it possible, and it's not really important, the electronic studies, but what we see here is a continued progression in the same way. And so we actually come to a state where throughout human history, we've always had these same systems that have been in control, these monetized systems and these systems where people had to work extremely hard, usually for someone else, the people who worked the land and grew it. And this system managed to maintain humanity for a long, long time. Then along comes the Industrial Revolution, and suddenly people didn't have to work so hard. And so there's a certain freedom that's achieved with this, which is, I think, undeniable. The fact that people could work fewer hours and achieve more made it possible for them to have things like leisure time that was non-existent before. And all of these things like the ability to read and write increased tremendously thanks to it. Lots and lots of different capabilities and skills and tools became available to common people who until that point in history really didn't have the education or anything around them that could help steer them away from their current state. And so the Industrial Revolution is, I think, a critical step in allowing people to have more freedom, whether it's freedom in their time or freedom with what they do with their time as well. Then along comes the information technology. And with the information technology, we have another step forward, another boost to this whole movement of both freeing mankind and allowing him to have or to achieve more with less energy, and at the same time distancing ourselves from it and actually causing people to have more time and less to do with it in a way. Now, obviously, this is a state that we can see around us today taken to the extreme, but I would like to focus on those years where information technology and this whole age of information began. Because I think it's very interesting that at the same time that this technological revolution was taking place, there was another very different revolution that was happening. And this revolution was, well, what's called the hippie revolution. Now, I want to talk a little bit about these two revolutions that occurred more or less simultaneously that appear to be very, very different, because I believe that the combination of these two have had a huge impact on humanity, which is really undeniable, but that impact has led to many different eco-villages ideas, and specifically the eco-village model that I'm talking about in this podcast. So in 1967, there seems to be a real gathering of this hippie movement and a catharsis. And so I'm just going to offer a quick quote over here, which is again from Wikipedia, but it's a really good place to get this information easily. And so this is describing the hippie movement, and I'd like you to pay attention to what the key points are. So from around 1967, its, as in the hippies movement, its fundamental ethos included harmony with nature, communal living, artistic experimentation, particularly in music, and the widespread use of recreational drugs. So if we look at that list very quickly, we can see today that a lot of those ethoses, or a lot of those ways of living and priorities are still very much in action today, and we can see them actually gathering momentum and gathering popularity. I think it's important to remember that during the whole swinging 60s and the hippie revolution, the number of people who were actually denouncing society, moving out, or doing, engaging in a really hippie lifestyle was very, very small. I've read estimates, and it's hard to say exactly, but roughly of the hardcore hippies who really were living in communes and left society, there's an estimate of around 200,000. This is in the US only. And of what they call, like part-time hippies, so people who didn't leave school, but in their free time, they engaged in different activities and, went to protests, another around 200,000 of those. So 400,000 altogether, which when you work it out, comes out to, I think, about 1% of the population. So the numbers of this movement were very, very small, and yet it received a lot of attention. It's still today one of the most famous movements, I think, in the last century or so, and we can all witness just how far-reaching the waves of that movement was when you consider how small a population, how small a group of people were actually driving that. And so, sorry. When we talk about the hippie movement and the people who were part of it, it's obvious that we can't ignore the fact that there was a widespread use of, recreational drugs, and I think recreational might be a little bit inaccurate as to what these people were trying to do with these substances. Now, I think I'm going to say something right now before I continue. When it comes to the eco-village model, the use of psychedelics, the use of recreational drugs, I don't see any inherent connection between the two. That is, that I don't see it as being some sort of drug cult where people are forced to ingest things and have no, absolutely not. But I think in order to understand the eco-village model, and for me, in order to reach the conclusions that I've reached, it's crucial to understand just what the psychedelic revolution was and the role that it played in the continuation of the humanity to this day. And so I think there's sort of three critical movements that we see going on here. The first is the information technology and all of the computer technologies that we see. The second is the hippie movement at large, and we can point specifically to the parts of it which are living in harmony in nature, with nature, living in communes, etc. And this whole field of what was called recreational drugs, which really didn't start with the hippie movement. The hippies certainly adopted it, but it came before, and it came from a purely scientific place. So I think, and I believe, that the three movements here are very much in charge and responsible for what we see around us today, and for a way out of the problems that we have with the current systems. So let's talk about information technology. When this revolution occurred around 1960s, it was certainly talked about and broadcast, but in comparison, it didn't make as many waves, and obviously people didn't quite realize just how far-reaching it was going to be. And so when this revolution was taking place, there were actually far more people who were taking part in it, developing it, whether they were scientists who were working, whether they were amateurs who were new to the computer world and were starting to test it out, whether they were chemists who were working on the, the technology that goes behind it, the actual transistors and all of the different elements that were necessary to make this technology possible. And so it's sort of an inverse relationship to the hippie movement, where in the hippie movement, in the beginning, there were very few people, relatively speaking, and a lot of attention and a lot of psychological awareness of this movement. And with the information technology, there were quite a few people who were dealing with it in terms of the industry, and yet it wasn't as well known. And over time, I think these two positions sort of switched around, whereby if you look at the world today, and if you look at America specifically, I'm pretty sure there are more people who identify themselves as hippies than there were in the 1960s. That movement certainly isn't the same that it was, and they say that there was obviously this period where it had a lull and much less attention. But we can definitely see over the last few years a growing interest, if not in that term hippies, then at least in what they represented and what they believed in. Talking about harmony with nature and communal living and artistic experimentation, etc. And so as time went on, this information technology became more advanced and the results became more immediate for people, and we could actually see in front of us the results. And that's, I think, the shift, the turning point where it became much more well known and people started realizing just how far it can go. Now, at the same time, there's this very unusual revolution taking place, which is the psychedelic revolution. Now, I've had some experience with psychedelics myself. For a long period of time, I was very, very interested in the subject as a whole, and I researched it quite a lot. And it's taught me many things, but one of the very interesting stories, I think, that comes out of the psychedelic revolution was the story of a man by the name of Gordon Wasson. If any of you have heard of him, I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly. But Gordon Wasson was a somewhat... he wasn't really a trained scientist or a mycologist, but he was married to a woman called... I've forgotten her name. Oh my gosh, I'll try and look for it at the same time. I do apologize. But he was married to a woman from Russia. And there's a story that they tell that one day they were out walking in the woods, and his wife saw some mushrooms growing on the ground. And she recognized them as mushrooms that she would eat as a child back in Russia. And she picked them to take them home to cook and to eat. And her husband, Gordon Wasson, was absolutely shocked that she would do this. And he was really... they actually got into a very serious argument because he was sure that she was going to die and that he would find her dead next day if she ate these mushrooms. And she really couldn't understand what he was talking about. These were edible mushrooms that she knew that were fine. And so she ate them, and he was really upset because he thought she was killing himself and killing herself. And the next day when she woke up, he had this real shock and this revelation. And this started his research basically into the history of mushrooms and the demonization of mushrooms in most of Western Europe at that time. And I mean, this launched his whole career in studying mushrooms in general. But among those, that research, that brought him to a little village in Mexico, in South America. And in that village, he met a female shaman called Maria Sabina, who was the shaman of this village, and she ingested and she used magic mushrooms as her method of practicing shamanism. And so Gordon Wasson in 1954, if I'm not very much mistaken, 1952, I'll just have a look. But in the 1950s, he was the first white person to partake in a shamanic ritual and ingest magic mushrooms in recorded history, and possibly the first person ever. And so this was a very interesting revelation for me, because here's this white person who is the first white person to ever ingest these mushrooms in a shamanic ritual in recorded history, and possibly ever. And at the same time, these shamans and these societies were partaking in these rituals and had been doing so for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, it's something that's been going on literally for one of the longest standing traditions that we have evidence for. So this, patient zero said Valentina, thank you. Yes, I knew someone here would know. So last time, yep, sorry, just reading the chat there. So this real secret that was withheld from Western Europe, from a big part of humanity for so long, had suddenly been unveiled in this fateful night. And obviously Gordon Wasson had a very powerful experience, and he went back to America. And in America, he met with a man by the name of Albert Hofmann. And if you know a little bit about psychedelic history, then you might recognize the name as the man who invented LSD, whether he invented or discovered it or whatever you want to call it. But he was the man who basically first synthesized LSD. And so Gordon Wasson met with him, and he wanted him to discover what the molecule was in the mushroom, the psychoactive component. And eventually, Albert Hofmann managed to do so, and he synthesized it, and he created the first synthetic psilocybin and psilocin tablets. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is because the beginning of this psychedelic revolution seems to be tremendously lucky in a way. It doesn't really come as a natural evolution that we can see. It sort of landed upon humanity at a certain time after being hidden for literally thousands of years, because the Spanish invaders reached South America, and along with other European countries, 400 years ago. And for all that time, they had witnessed, obviously, these shamanic rituals, and there's certain telling of it, but no one was ever allowed to partake, and they really didn't show any interest. It was only when this mad scientist came along that there was this first opportunity for a white person to experience something that was completely out of context, where he had nothing in his social upbringing that could prepare him for this moment. And so we see a very curious occurrence of information technology being at a technological point where it can actually advance humanity in the way that it did. We have this very, very significant hippie movement, which is certainly changing society, and among it, one of its biggest parts is the criticism of modernity and the criticism of industrialization. And then into that mix, we suddenly find these very, very powerful hallucinogenics that seem to shift everything, into high gear or into chaos or whatever you want to call it. And in fact, a lot of the early experimentations with LSD that was done by scientists. Scientists were able to sort of procure this very new and unknown drug that had these very powerful side effects. And a lot of scientists were actually using that for experiments in order to try and tackle problems that they had, at the time, and to take LSD and to try and see if that changed the way they thought about it, to encourage creativity. It was really a very interesting time for the use of these substances. Now, of course, we all know what happened after that. The hippie movement at large and the psychedelic movement in particular were outlawed and were demonized, and the witch hunt began, which we still see occurring today. But I don't want to talk about that, because that, I think, is less important. That's a very natural reaction of a system when it's being threatened by really forces that it doesn't quite understand and it can't really come to terms with yet. We can see with the Army's treatment of LSD and what it was doing that it really had no idea what these substances were or how to use them. But I think someone who might have a little bit of an idea about these substances was Albert Hofmann. And Albert Hofmann's relationship with LSD is a very complex one. In fact, he wrote a book called LSD, My Problem Child. And I think it certainly epitomizes his relationship as being someone who brought forth this unique substance that's really unparalleled before in terms of production in a laboratory, and that caused both tremendous highs and lows. It must be very a very complex thing to grapple with. But on Albert Hofmann's 100th birthday, I just uploaded it to the chat. He has a quote where he says, "I think that in human evolution, it has never been as necessary to have this substance LSD. It is just a tool to turn us into what we are supposed to be." So I think what Albert Hofmann is trying to say here is quite clear, that LSD is not anything else. Just like a lot of technology, it's a tool. But the phrasing that he uses here to turn us into what we are supposed to be is a very curious choice. So this speech was on his 100th birthday, which was in 2003, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, patient zero, absolutely. And so it's after a lot. It obviously isn't, for us it might be quite a long time ago. But in 2003, after everything that had happened with the hippie movement and the war on drugs, etc., I think Albert Hofmann really managed to stay true to what he first experienced on the first acid trip that he took. And speaking of human evolution and things that are necessary, I really agree with his sentiment here. I believe, and this is my personal belief, that it wasn't just by chance that the psychedelics were discovered at the same time that the information technology was being developed, and that it was adopted by the hippie movement, which was, among other things, looking for a greater connection with nature. And so I think if we have to look at it today, when I'm sort of looking back on this whole evolution, we see that the information technology developed into many, many different things. But without a doubt, one of the most important things that we've seen from it is the internet. And I certainly am not going to start talking about how important the internet is or how it changed the world. Instead, I'd like to take this concept of the internet as a second half of a complete story with, whether you want to call it the hippie movement or psychedelics or nature at large, is the other half. I'm just going to read a few of the comments because I've missed a few here. Patient Zero says, "Am I supposed to be tripping balls every now and then?" Did he actually say that? No, he didn't say that, but that's a very good point. Claiborne said, "I like Timothy Leary and Ram Dass's research into LSD." Absolutely. I mean, Timothy Leary, I think, had a few misguided notions towards psychedelics in general, and being in an authoritative position with younger people who look up to you. And obviously these things weren't known back then, but today, especially with psychedelic use being shown as mind altering or mind control techniques, or in cults, we see the dangers of people treating psychedelics very, very lightly. I don't think Timothy Leary meant to do harm. I really do believe that he saw himself as someone who could help humanity, who could free humanity. But I think that he was careless and rather quick. If you compare him to other scientists who are also researching and experimenting with LSD, but were doing so in a much more careful and controlled environment. Revived Sociology says, "The lessons we learned as teenagers on LSD. Really, we just wanted to get off our nut, but it turned us into philosophers." Wow, that is very accurate. I like that. I'm quite glad I went through my drug place in the late 80s. By the 90s, ecstasy had just taken over. Yes, there's a lot to be said about researching the different drug use and drugs that are prevalent and the effect that it has on society. I think that's a very crucial point to what I'm trying to say. Okay, so I want to talk about this concept a little bit, where there's these two polar opposites which complete each other: the internet and psychedelics. And I think first we can see some similarities between the two. They're both networks in a way. The internet is obviously, the actual internet is a connection of different, whether it's computers or devices, across distances, and the ability to connect and to share information. Now, on the other side, we have the psychedelics, which, in my personal experience, and this is something that I think is rather agreed upon, certainly have a network feel. And I'm going to talk specifically about mushrooms more than LSD, just because it's a lot easier to see the comparison. We literally have mycelial networks, and if you've heard of Paul Stamets and his work, he says that these mycelial networks were basically the precursors to the internet, which sort of makes sense if you see the way that it all works. The mycelium, for those who don't know, is made up of each of these cells that are sort of connected, and there's no real body in a way. There aren't really these different parts. There are just these very, very ephemeral, very thin strands of biological matter that are simply constantly transporting nutrients and water and information to other parts of the mycelial network. So we can see a lot of similarities in these connectedness phenomenon. But what about the differences between the two? When we look at the internet, we see somewhat the epitomization of this virtual reality, where to the extent that we can really immerse ourselves in this reality and have it supply all of the stimulation that we would need in terms of our cognition and our mental state. And this virtual reality is so alluring. I mean, I think I've heard a lot of people talking about virtual glasses, augmented reality, and having virtual reality goggles where you really do immerse yourself in it, and they're becoming more popular now. And I don't think, I'm personally not that afraid of them taking over to this dystopian world where nobody ever leaves their, television or goggles, because what they have there is better than real life. But that's my personal opinion. The reason I think that is because the internet is an epitome of one side of reality. that mental side, that virtual side, that side that allows us to dream and to think and to talk, to share ideas, but is very much completely disconnected from the physical reality, from nature. And we see again, as we saw with the Industrial Revolution, taking this further step into a world that is actually detached from reality as we know it. On the other half, on the other side of this coin, we have the psychedelics, where if you've ever experienced ingesting psychedelics, let's talk specifically about mushrooms, in my personal experience, really does feel like connecting with nature, connecting with the earth. I mean, I've laid down on a wall, on a brick wall, and just feel myself melting and becoming one with that brick wall. It's a very sensorial experience. There's obviously a lot mentally going on as well, and it's a big part of it, the verbal side for me at least, but in terms of the experience, it's a tremendously physical experience. And we see it as a sort of counteraction to the internet, in the sense that both are very, very ethereal, both are very much outside our ability to completely grasp and to completely hold in our heads, and yet they're both pulling us in opposite directions to these two poles of nature versus technology. And so, okay, let me just catch up very quickly. PSA, don't meditate too deeply about mad cow disease while on mushrooms. Those dots are never meant to be connected. That's very good. So, we're talking about the internet and the psychedelic movement as both pulling humanity in opposing directions, but at the same time pushing us forward. And I think that if we look at the structures that have been in place until now in the systems, what we talked about in the beginning, where it's so hard for ordinary people to break free, or it was so hard for many, many years because they simply didn't have the chance. Now, in a very, very short period of time, we see these three revolutions coming forward and offering an alternative. We see the information technology allowing people to be relieved from manual labor and be able to have more leisure time to think and to learn and to educate themselves. We see the psychedelic movement reconnecting people with nature, reconnecting people with these different ideals and these different beliefs and ancient thoughts that have been sort of around for a long time, and yet there was a definite lull in the years before that. And we see the hippie movement coming and adopting this psychedelic phenomenon as a crucial part of its ability to show people what it's all about and to convince people of the necessity to really reconnect with ourselves and with nature. And so I think that this brings us very nicely to the point where we're looking for that model. So we have all of the pieces in play. We have humanity to a certain extent being enslaved through money and basic survival needs being controlled. And we have this industrial revolution, which almost happens unintentionally because the technology is there to allow it, and people for the first time experiencing freedom, experiencing leisure, really for the first time in history. And then we jump forward to the 1960s, where in a very, very short span of time, we see huge technological advancements, huge waves of people who are questioning the mainstream reality and questioning the system, and people actually walking away from it. Now, sorry about that. The thing is, for me at least, in the hippie movement and a lot of movements that grew out of it, there was a certain immaturity. And this immaturity was obvious, was necessary, because this was the first time it was happening. People hadn't really en masse decided to just walk away from the system without actually having something else in place, just because they didn't believe in the system anymore and they felt that it was actually abusing them to a certain degree. And so it's very easy to see how, along with psychedelic substances, people can easily lose control, lose their identity, lose the stability, the psychological stability that they had, and not yet have something to replace it. And so in shamanic practices, whenever a member of the tribe went through any experience, it was very much secured in a known and very well researched social acceptance of what is happening and why it's happening, and this whole structure that actually can hold you during these very difficult experiences. With most of the hippies in the 1960s, there was no social structure in place that could provide that stability, that could help guide them through these very difficult experiences. And obviously we see the dangers and the problems that came out of that. Because of that, there was a certain lull in the hippie movement, in the psychedelic research. It was outlawed itself, and all of the scientific work that was done basically was put on hold until I'd say around early 2000s, more or less. And in early 2000s, there seemed to be a growing interest among scientists who had sort of had enough of it, of waiting for this long, and really said, you know, we can't let these substances just lie there with the potential that we know they had. If you don't know about any scientific research regarding the medicinal uses of psychedelics, I mean, there's so much to choose from. It's really a huge field that's just growing over time, and the statistics are absolutely amazing. So if you have no idea, I'd highly suggest looking into it. Iboga is a great place to start. Ayahuasca, they've been treating terminal patients with magic mushrooms. Lots and lots of researches. I won't even go into it. So we come to this state where we've suddenly got all of the tools that we need to free ourselves, and yet we don't really have a system that will guide us in how to do it. Excuse me, sorry. So, in my mind, in my experience, in my life, this was the point that I had reached. I'd learned about the hippie movement. I'd learned about psychedelics. I'd experienced them. I, came to a point where I believed in their potential. And now I wanted to know what to do. Just to leave school and not get a job is not actually doing something. And this is part of what brought forward the ecoVillage model. When I'm talking about the ecoVillage model in general and what I've been planning and working on these last few years, it really is meant to be a model that's there to free humanity from the constraints that have been placed on it for so long. And the way to do this is to use these different parts that we've been going over. And so obviously we've talked a lot about the natural side of things, the connection with nature, the importance of working with your hands at doing all of this. But what about the information technology? The ecoVillage model is the opposite of a technophobe. It's a technophile. It relies on the modern technology in order for it to work. And this occurs in many, many different areas. I can see that I'm coming up to the end, so I might not have enough time to go over everything. Whatever I don't, I'll try and I'll go over next episode. But I'll talk about one thing which I think is the most crucial. And this isn't the ecoVillage token, the cryptocurrency. That whole thing is a big subject that I want to do a whole episode on, and I feel that I'm not knowledgeable enough to actually do it. So I'm going to try and see if I can get someone to come along. But for now, I'm going to talk about another part, and that is the educational part of the ecoVillage model. Now, there are many ecovillages out there today, and a lot of them are pursuing this privacy, this escaping society, being left alone out in the wilderness, not having to deal with all of these rules and regulations. I've met a lot of these people, and I certainly understand that tendency. However, I feel that the ecoVillage model needs to be somewhat different, because For two reasons. Number one, when you're escaping society, you are becoming something that is outside of it, and therefore something that it can both fear and attack through whatever way, whether it's with building permits or with, coming down and investigating someone, telling them there was drug use or whatever it is. I've seen so many cases of society's agents, mainly the police, etc., attacking these communes where there really wasn't much of a reason to, but just because they are outside and can be viewed as a threat. And so, thank you, Revised Sociology. The other part of it is that when you distance yourself, you are limiting your impact. And so your impact becomes much more powerful to those who are closest to you, to those who are around you. But that impact is a very, very narrow, much smaller sphere of impact. The whole idea of the eco-village model, if it is going to affect this change, which I believe it can, it has to be publicized. And by publicized, I don't mean just that to tell people about it, but there are two parts. First, it is absolutely necessary for it to be completely sincere. Once you open yourself to the outside world and once you become, as it were, something that someone can research, it is absolutely crucial to always have the truth on your side. And the only way to do that is to always remain sincere. Whether you're making mistakes or not doesn't matter. What matters is that you are both upfront and completely open about it. Excuse me. The second part deals with a much larger part of the eco-village model, and in a way this is sort of what started the whole thing for me, and that is the educational side. Throughout history we can see that through lack of education it is so easy to manipulate and control a people. As soon as you hide information and as soon as you continue them being uneducated, you are making it much more easy to control those people. And the opposite is quite true, as we know, knowledge is power. So a crucial part of the eco-village, in order for it to be able to affect change, is to educate as many people as possible, and to have a branch of education that will be open to anyone. When I say anyone, obviously it'll be hard to guarantee that. But with the help of information technology, reaching everyone becomes a possibility more so than it has ever been. And so with this information technology, with what we have today, it's possible to reach everyone in the world for free and provide the information for those people to, for example, start their own eco-villages. And so this is a very, very big part of the eco-village model. There will be a big emphasis on this global educational initiative, which is there are people who are going to be living in the eco-village, there are people who are going to be visiting the eco-village, but most of the people will never be able to get there, simply statistically speaking. And so there has to be a large enough impact that you can actually reach all of these people. And I think there are lots of ways of doing this, and obviously one of the easiest is having these educational videos. Personally, I've learned so much of what I know today and things that I've done, whether it's playing music or weaving or building certain things, just by watching people on the internet doing it and doing it myself. So this is a proved method for educating large numbers of people for very little money and time, relatively speaking. Okay, I'm going to take a small break here. I can see we're coming up to the end, and I just want to go over the chat because I've missed quite a few comments here, and I do want to read them. One moment, I just have to cough. Sorry. Let's see. Revised Sociology said, I've thought about buying land somewhere and escaping, but the thought of being in a damp field somewhere on my own just sounds a bit crap. Absolutely. And I mean, even if you're not on your own, if you're in a group of 20 or 30 or 50 people, it somehow is still, especially to us today, a small number of people, as it were. And I mean, yeah, I've personally fantasized about escaping to a cave somewhere, honestly, before I had a family. But when I'm thinking about how best to help humanity and how best to alleviate so much of this suffering, it just feels to me that there's more that I could do than just taking care of myself or taking care of my personal family. Claiborne says, gotta be authentic. Absolutely. It's so crucial to any step of the ecoVillage establishment, whether it's between the members, whether it's between supporters outside, and whether it's people at large and the authorities. Has to be completely sincere all the time. Fake it till you make it gives me that nails on the chalkboard feeling in my brain. Well put. Crimson Clad. Oh, Crimson Clad, I didn't see you were here. Good to see you. You can do that in a way that isn't incongruous with authenticity, though it doesn't always instantly equate to lie about what you're doing. If you're working on changing a behavior, your desire to do so and the way you approach it, the actions you take are authentic. Even if it means that you have to say fake the confidence or the comfort level of, or whatever, on a personal level. That is a very good point. I was actually going to say something similar, because it's interesting, this sort of, we can take it deeper, because fake it till you make it or being sincere are really two things that we sort of do all the time. We lie to other people to make them feel better. We lie to ourselves because we don't know. You know, we deal with this fake, veneer that we wear, these masks that we wear all the time. And we know that the real, true, authentic me is somewhere in between all of those, but not quite any one of those individually. So it's an interesting, debate. But I think exactly, as long as you're authentic and sincere, even if you're faking something, or even if you're, whatever it is, pretending, if your intentions and your actions are authentic to change, then I think that means a big difference than when you're, lying to others or pretending to be something because you want to, get whatever affection that will give you without actually having to change. Claiborne answered, I would just call that working on changing or improving my behavior, but I suppose we're talking about the same thing. Yes, exactly. Well done. Okay, I think I missed a few parts of the chat, but I do apologize to those who I didn't see. I promise at the end of the show I do go back and read everything that I missed. I'm learning so much in this podcast so far, so thank you very much to all of you who participate and enlighten me as well. Okay, I think that'll probably be the general idea. And so before I finish up with the last few minutes, I want to say that the ecoVillage model began as an educational center. And before it comes to providing people with food, or generating income, or actually changing current systems, it's very, very important to constantly remember this educational process. I think it really is key to any community, to any project, to be willing to learn. And that means that there's these two sides that are constantly going on. One of those is the teacher and the other is the student. And that means the ecoVillage as a whole should put it at the top priority to find people that it can help by educating them. And this will obviously be done on the ecoVillage as well, and people who come for seminars or whatever will learn skills. In fact, we're hoping to have a building session in the summer if we have everything ready in time. So we'll stay in tune for that. I'm sure Alex and myself will update as we know what's going on. But even more so, at the other end, what we were talking about, connecting humanity as a whole, allowing all of humanity together to be educated, is the only way that I can see out of this current mess. Because really a big part of the system that we have in place today came about because people were uneducated. People believed their rulers and leaders who said, oh, this is the way it is, and I'm the king, and you have to work for me, and I'll take care of you. And they weren't educated enough to know that there could be another way. Now, obviously, I'm not blaming anyone in that sense, but it does mean that I think one of the highest responsibilities that we have is to make this information available to as many people who want to learn about it. And if we do that in a consistent way and in a successful way, meaning that people can actually, whether it's watch these educational videos or partake in the seminars or read instructions or whatever, sorry, that people will be able to take this information and then take it in upon themselves, process it, and obviously have their own results, etc., but be able to use this to free themselves and then become educators themselves who can start teaching those who are around them. And so we see this sort of spreading like an infectious virus, as is mentioned with the term memes, where these ideas can spread. I really do believe that starting with one single eco-village in one place in the world, through the use of technology, can grow and can spread to all different parts. I don't know how quickly this could happen. Obviously, a lot of this is my personal beliefs and longings, but assuming that the eco-village model works, and there's no reason to assume that it won't, assuming that it is possible to grow your food and collect your water and take care of your waste, etc., and this has been proven to be possible, then what person or what community in our world would refuse the information and the education to be able to do that for themselves? I really don't see how, how this can possibly have a detrimental effect. And so, okay, I think that's probably where I'm going to cut it for now, talking about this. I'm sorry, I'm just watching chat in the middle. Let me just go over very quickly and see if there was something else that I wanted to say that I missed, but I think I got it all. So next week, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the eco token, and I'm going to try and find someone who will come and aid me. Maybe I'll see how I manage with that, technologically speaking. But this whole field of the eco token is a completely, it's this whole section that I'm just getting into now as a relatively new steamer. So you'll have to forgive me that I haven't spoken about it more so far. And I just want to remind before I go that the eco-village model, and when I specifically say the eco-village model, is not the eco-village that's being started in Portugal. The project that we're doing in Portugal comprises many different people, not just me, and it's being worked out, and reality will obviously, chime in every once in a while and change our ways. When I talk about the eco-village model, that's the model that I'm suggesting that we've been developing, that is replicable anywhere throughout the world. And in any place that it will be implemented will be a little bit different, will be, suitable to the area and to the people and to the culture, etc., etc. But these fundamental parts, these underlying principles of providing food, providing water, providing all of the basic needs will obviously be there in each one of these cases. Okay, so thank you very, very much for listening. It's been wonderful to be here, and I wish you all a great week and see you all next time.